This is God and Autobiography, the podcast, a dramatic adaptation and continuing discussion of the book God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin. He was a lifelong agnostic, but one day he had an occasion to pray. To his vast surprise, God answered in words. Being a philosopher, he had a lot of questions, and God had a lot to tell him. Episode 213. Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Langdon. Today, on our latest edition of the Life Wisdom Project series, Jerry welcomes Dr. Richard Oxenberg back to the program to discuss episode 23. It's the point in Jerry's journey with God when Jerry takes some time to come up for air, as he puts it, and asks God, what's the point of it all? If you're a regular listener to the podcast, you'll easily remember Richard as not only a dear friend of our work here, but also as Jerry's dialogue partner in our series, Two Philosophers Wrestle with God. You can find the audio version of that series here on this channel, or you can get your hands on a brand new copy of the book version, published as Two Philosophers Wrestle with God, a Dialogue, available at Amazon.com. Here now are Jerry and Richard. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Today, Richard Oxenberg and I are talking about episode 23. In which I ask, it's one of the episodes I think of as where I come up for air, because I've been praying about particular, sacred texts and different traditions, or pursuing some question on my own mind, suffering, evil, ego, whatever. And I'm engaged in the pieces. And then occasionally I feel, wait, I'm like swimming across the Atlantic. I want to come up and look, where's the land? Where am I? And so here that coming up for air takes the form of asking God, what is the point of it all?
Right.
And if we talk about life wisdom, well, you need to have some sense, right, of what it is you're about. You might say what you're doing, this and that and the other thing, all the parts of one's life. Why are you shopping at the grocery store, filling your tank with gas? What is it for? And you want some bigger question than, oh, well, my car is going to run out of gas. Otherwise, we're going to run out of food. Otherwise, but there are bigger questions about life and how all these projects relate together. They don't necessarily have to relate together, but some sense of, well, life isn't just putting gas in your car and shopping for groceries. What more is it? And I find in this discussion with God, as often happens, God is challenging not only my particular beliefs that I brought to the discussion, but my way of thinking about the question.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what happens here. Did that strike you, Richard?
Yeah. There's always with the book as a whole and the basic revelation, right? It's always seems to me to be giving us a both and rather than an either or.
That's
right?
Part of that thinking differently. And God has to hammer that into me over and over.
Right.
Our friend, me and other people, I guess, think of either or. It's this or it's that. But not quite.
There's a teleology, and yet it's not a means end teleology. In other words, it's not a teleology that at some point comes to an end, and you say, well, now we've finished it and it's complete. It's a teleology that has a sort of, in a sense, it's a kind of working out of the horizontal or working out of the vertical through the horizontal. if I can put it that way. But the vertical
Yeah,
always remains.
I think that's a good way to put it. The vertical is those aspects of transcendence and ultimacy and so forth
Right.
in our lives of ultimate value or importance. And then but we're living life one moment to the next, right? Putting one
moment to the next.
other, and so that the two have to be connected.
They have to be connected, and but the horizontal never resolves itself. The way that we might tend to think of it is, well, you're trying to use the horizontal to get to the vertical, right? You're trying to arrive at some place, and then you're done with the horizontal. But that's not the way that it is presented here. It's that every moment in that sort of horizontal or temporal progression, right, has the potential for reflecting the ultimate values that are part of the vertical or somehow failing to reflect those. And so every moment presents its own challenge. And in some sense, that is both the meaning of life, as I read it, to find the way in which this particular moment that I'm living in, right, has can be reflective of what is ultimately good and true. Um, uh, but it's also the nature of life, not just in the sense that this is what we ought to do, but this is what the nature of reality, the nature of the cosmos, the nature of God demands of us. In other words, this is the task that reality has set before us, which is because it never ends. I mean, the horizontal never ends. It goes on and on and on forever. There's no finally arriving at the vertical and saying, well, now we're done.
But when you think of that, some people, and this was my first reaction, well, that's a disappointing answer. I want a happy ending, and I say, I want something like a story, and there's a happy ending. And then you can see the pieces of the story as helping to bring about that happy ending, and
right.
Okay, everything's nice, but
and yet there's a real paradox to the idea of a happy ending. The paradox that I sometimes bring up with my students when we're teaching Aristotle. When I'm teaching Aristotle, Aristotle's ethics is about an examination of what he calls eudaimonia, which is often translated happiness. And so, and happiness is the ultimate telos of life, the ultimate ending, right? Everybody wants a happy ending. But what I sometimes say to my students is, well, what do we mean by saying that happiness is the goal of life? I mean, do we mean by that once you become happy, then you will no longer want to live?
Right? Yeah. You can fold up your tent at that point.
Now I'm happy. Now I can shoot myself because I've arrived at the goal of life. No, happiness is something to be lived, right? It's not a goal that you arrive at and now you're done. It's a goal that you pursue in the course of living. And what you want to do is live as happily as possible, not get to happiness and then be finished. And so I think that's an idea that is very much being expressed in the book here.
Yeah. I think Aristotle also makes the distinction that I think be relevant right here between, action and passion is one way to put it, between activities done for instrumental purposes. Action and production is probably a clearer way to put the distinction. And production is done, you plant seed in the harvest in one season so that you can harvest in the next season, and so that you can have food and sustain yourself. So that is instrumental. And that's a huge part of life, is we're doing things for instrumental purposes. But there's also action, which is those things, the difference between planting, our relation to nature when we're planting food and harvesting it, and our relation to nature when we take a walk in the woods. We're not taking a walk in the woods to achieve something other than a walk in the woods. Or when we contemplate beautiful sunset. We're not doing it for some other purpose. And for Aristotle, when we contemplate not only objects of beauty, but objects of intellectual interest, why do we ponder the meaning of the American Civil War or something like that? We ponder the meanings of things, and we don't do it in order to do something else. But that's an end in itself. That's an activity with its own internal self-sufficient purpose. And I think you're right, Richard. That would be useful categories for thinking about, that's what it is to live the horizontal moment to moment,
right, and
as a reflection of the ultimate.
Yeah, the language that I've used is there's the instrumental, and then there's the intrinsic.
Yes.
Right? There's what is instrumentally valuable in that it leads us to something, but ultimately the instrumental has to be for the purpose of the intrinsic, right? The instrumental value has to be for the purpose of achieving or bringing us closer to what is of intrinsic value.
Yes.
And so what we need to understand, I suppose, if we want to try and do this in a profitable way, is just what are those things that are of intrinsic value, right? I mean, that becomes one of the primary questions, and it's one of the questions that Aristotle asks, and I think it's a question that is implicit in God and Autobiography. That one of the things that is of intrinsic value is to recognize one's connection with the whole, right? I mean, it's one of the paradox of life is that we are individuals who are dependent upon a reality way beyond us. And it is, in some sense, through connecting with that greater reality that our own individuality is able to achieve its true intrinsic value or come to realize that or enjoy it.
Yeah. In this episode, this is explained in part by the example of love. That when you love someone, you don't say, what is that love for? And I think to make the most of these things, the example often starts with romantic love, because that's something graspable and we all understand that kind of phenomenon. But also other forms of love, family love, love of friends, even love of community or affection for community, those bonds that you have with neighbors and so forth, that they are not there for some other reason.
Right.
And that's the sort of Aristotelian test of intrinsic value. Is it something that, even without any further upshot, is a valuable moment? And if it's a valuable moment, then it's achieving this relation of the horizontal to the vertical, to the transcendent or ultimate.
Yeah. At the very end, I'm trying to remember now, at the very end of that episode, God speaks about, here, I may have written it down as a quote here, that in order to understand the nature of God and the nature of life, I think God finally says, one has to relax some of the logical constraints that make it difficult to accept that God can be both one and many, right? A person and much more than a person, immanent in nature and yet not reducible to nature. And so much of this has to do, it seemed to me, with this paradox of the one and the many, right? That the one, in a sense, in order for the one to realize, and when I say the one now, I'm talking about that which is ultimate in being, right? This ultimate oneness, as the book points out, as long as it remains to itself or in its own ultimate oneness, it doesn't realize its own potentiality, right? It has to give rise to this incredibly diverse universe with all its different facets and aspects and divergencies and differences in order for the one to fulfill itself. But then what we have is we have the problem of each of the separate pieces, each of the separate individuals are none of them is ontologically complete in itself. And so in a sense, that's where longing arises, right? All of a sudden you have each of these pieces have a longing for reconnection with the whole that is beyond them. And I think that longing is what we experience as the longing for love, the longing to be reconnected, the longing to be somehow taken outside or taken beyond the loneliness of being separate entities. And so there's this sort of endless erotic. I think the word erotic is used in the passage. This erotic yearning, not just sexual, right? But if we think of the erotic in a very broad sense, it can refer to the longing for union with that which is ontologically beyond us, but also that in which we are contained. And when we somehow satisfy that, even in fragmentary ways, right, with a romantic relationship, there's a great sense of liberation and a great sense of euphoria and a great sense of beauty that we experience. Yes.
People experience that in simple moments like joining a singing group, and you're all singing together. And there is something like a euphoria in the group when it's all working. You've practiced and practiced, and now it's come together, and you're doing some great piece of music you love, whatever it is. And I sometimes think of your engagement sometimes in amateur theater and community theater, Richard, as I know you were playing the rabbi and Fiddler on the Roof and so forth. Well, that too, you're creating bonds of affection.
Oh, absolutely.
And a common purpose.
I mean, the thing that I most wanted to be, I think when I was younger, was an actor.
Really?
Going into philosophy and stuff, but the thing that I most wanted to do was be an actor. And I've done a lot of amateur acting, as you point out.
Great.
But I played the rabbi and Fiddler on the Roof, and the most recent thing I did was I played Scrooge, actually.
Oh, really?
At a community theater. And what is it? What is it that is so? I've often asked myself, what is it that is so compelling, so attractive to me about theater? And it is the connection that you're making with an audience, that if you have a character that has some depth and you're able to enter into the depth of that character and then somehow bring it out to the audience so that you share those moments of depth with the audience, there's a way in which, once again, you transcend your isolation, and you become one with the audience for that moment. And it's a beautiful thing. It's like, and you need the audience there. You can pick up a script, and I've done it sometimes, and be in my own room and try and play the part, just for the fun of it. But it's just, you need somebody else. You need to have it be communicated to somebody else in order for whatever it is you're trying to achieve to be consummated. So, and that itself is also an act of love, I think.
Yes. Yes.
A yearning for love.
Yes. And so I take one of the, if we think of life wisdoms here, one of them is to think of your daily life in these terms. I know there are religious traditions in which before you open your shop each morning, you pray, because you're doing that not just to make a living, which obviously is what a lot of why you're doing. It's a necessary thing to do to make a living and feed yourself and your family and whatever. But the prayer is for let it be more than that.
Oh, yeah.
And for in my experience, if places I frequent that I value of just shops, cafes, and so forth around town, there's more to that interaction than just buying and selling. There is an appreciation of the other person, and often taking in, sometimes it's a bad day, and they let you know that, and you commiserate with them. There are other dimensions even to these simple relationships and your presence to whatever they're going through is itself an important expression of love and a way of bringing ultimacy, or whatever we want to call it, into one's daily life, into one's moment-to-moment life, because any interaction you have with anybody, of course, even your private moments, you're doing something, you're sending somebody an email, or, if you're academic, you're trying to think through some thoughts and write a paper or something, write a piece of research. Even that can be done in a loving mode. Mm-hmm. And with a mode that appreciates, venerates its intrinsic value.
Yeah. When you talk about the prayer, in that way, very much reminds me of halakha in Judaism, which has a prayer for just about everything.
Yes,
for everything. Do if I'm not an Orthodox Jew, but I've known some who are their life is constantly a life of prayer. Every act, every mundane act, we're sitting down to eat, we're putting on our shoes, or everything is the idea of the prayer is, at least as I've come to understand it, is to make you mindful of the eternity within which every individual moment has its being, so that you're not just stuck in that one individual moment, but you see that moment as reflecting, in a sense, the eternal reality, and somehow to have the individual be mindful of and reflective of the oneness of eternity while pursuing his or her individual acts. That takes you outside of your isolation, which I think is part of what love is all about, getting beyond one's own sense of separate isolation.
Yeah. So that's interesting, Richard, because as I see it, you're taking the human predicament, which each religion, in a sense, has its conception, sin, or not realizing you're the same as the Brahman, or the Buddhist, you believe the substantiality of things, you got to give that up, and then you won't suffer. But your soteriology, to use the technical term, what's the fundamental predicament? What's the fundamental predicament? And you're saying the fundamental predicament is we're just little bitty parts. And yet,
right.
In your mind, I know the first talk I ever heard you give, Richard, was on radical evil. And in part, the radical evil is the single individual thinking they can be the whole.
Well, that's what it is. And I find this message running through really all of the religions. You can think of it. I think of it sometimes in terms of the way it gets expressed in Buddhism. There's a legend, right, that before Buddha was born, a seer prophesied that Buddha would either become a world conqueror or a great spiritual sage, right? And his father heard the prophet. His father was a king, and immediately said, "Well, world conqueror, that's what we want."
Yeah,
right?
That's right. That's right. Be the next Alexander the Great of the East.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But what always struck me was that these two different paths were actually two different ways in which human beings pursue the overcoming of their ontological contingency and isolation. So one way is to say, well, I am dependent upon the world, and that places me in this very vulnerable position. And so the way that I'm going to resolve that is to conquer the world that I'm dependent upon. And now I can be in control of everything that I depend upon. And that's the path of world conquest. I mean, we're seeing that play itself out in our own politics, I think, in America right now. People who have that sort of path, who never can get enough. Elon Musk, with his $400 billion or however much it is. Anyway, but in any event, that's the path of world conquest. And all of the spiritual traditions basically say it doesn't work. You can't succeed, because what you can never succeed in doing is making yourself God, right? You can never succeed in making yourself the ontological ultimate, right? No amount of conquering the world is going to satisfy. And that's why greed is sort of endless, right? Because no matter how much you have, there's never enough, right? No matter how much of the world you've conquered, there's still more to be conquered. And so the other path is the path of spirituality. Rather than the path of conquest, it's the path of communion. It's the path of entering into a communion relationship or a love relationship with the world beyond. And that actually requires, from a spiritual point of view, almost the opposite disposition of the world conqueror. Because what is required is a sort of humility, right? You have to open yourself up to the other and come to an appreciation of the other, rather than trying to usurp the other into yourself. And so, and these, in many ways, these are the two dimensions, that the two paths that human beings are tempted to, as a way of resolving what we might call their finitude, their contingency, their ontological vulnerability. And I guess most of the religious traditions will say that only one of those paths can actually finally work.
Yeah, I mean, that's the powerful side. It's not just, oh, we have a higher path, and then you got to be talked into, well, what makes it higher, and aren't we all relativists or something like that? Who's to make judgments, as the Pope said, who am I? But um, but it just doesn't work. So you can be the most hard-headed, practical person and say, well, you want the life of acquisition, of endless acquisition, consume
Right.
everything you can find to consume. Well, that ends up with nothing. We end up with nothing, because I often notice having a dessert, guilty dessert, the first 2 or 3 bites are the best. By the time I get to the end,
Right.
it's kind of old. And so I've tried to train myself, just have a bite or two, and you'll have all the joy and not the cost.
Yeah.
But you need to look at what works, and one after another. You look at the biographies of the dictators. I've been reading some of that recently. Well, they all end up kind of miserable. In fact, Plato says nobody is unhappy as the tyrant. The tyrant has no friends, and the tyrant
Right.
has enemies.
Right.
And Hobbes points out in his brutally realistic way, nobody is so powerful they can't be killed in their sleep. which
Right.
may be what happened to Stalin. There's a wonderful little comic version that's rather historically based called The Death of Stalin that's on Netflix or something. And but it doesn't work, folks. Whereas if you live a more loving life was one way to put it, but a life that is willing to acknowledge everything, everybody and everything as their own intrinsic, having their own intrinsic value, you probably, if you're in a nice middle-class country, roll in a country like America, you have plenty to eat. And you don't need to eat and eat and eat. And you don't need to boss this person and that person and the next person. You have your own little domain of autonomy.
And I also think that this is where God comes in. Not only as a lawgiver who says, love your neighbor as yourself and so forth, but I mean, there is something about our individuality where we're not only finite spatially, that is, we don't extend to the whole of what is, right? But we're of course also finite temporally, right? We're all destined for death, and that also is, death is at least confronts us as that which is going to cut us off from being altogether, right? Cut us off from any kind of relationship, right? In some sense, one might say that, the world conqueror is going to die, but so is the philanthropist. The philanthropist isn't going to escape death either. But somehow, one of the things that I think religion is trying to provide us with is a sense of being connected with, or in communion with, that which is ultimate and eternal. And it is through that connection, through coming to see oneself as part of this eternal reality, that one can finally overcome the sense of finality that subjection to death brings. And that is also a kind of love that is required, right? In a sense, this is all summed up in what is called the Great Commandment in Christianity, right? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy might, and thy neighbor as thyself. The one is a command, or an attempt to get the person to experience a sense of communion with the eternal, with God, and the other is a communion with everyone else. So one is a vertical connection, and the other is the horizontal connection. And somehow, if you can achieve both of those, you will achieve what the Bible says is eternal life. So that's the path. It seems to me that all the religions are pointing us toward,
and they're
in their
ways.
different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's in part because cultures are also particular.
I was, cultures
no single
are
religion is the one and only religion.
Right.
But although they seek that often, and even to the point of violence and so forth, that's all an old story and maybe overtold, because there are other kinds of violence too. But each religion has to, this is part of one thrust that I took out of God and Autobiography. As you know, Richard, I was told to start Theology Without Walls, that you need to recognize, okay, I'm pursuing maybe loving my God with all my heart and soul and my neighbors. And the Buddhist is doing something else that involves deep meditation, and the Hindu something else, and there are others as well, and they're each achieving some kind of intrinsic value, or as you would put it, Richard, connecting to the whole or the eternal, the thing that's really real. That's the crucial thing. It's what's really real. And they're all doing it in their different ways because what's really real can be, you might say, accessed or related to in a variety of ways. That's part of, you might say, the greatness of God, as I would tend to put it in my theistic language, but that's part of the greatness of the ultimate reality, is that it can be related to in many concrete ways, including, as we were talking, some of these humble ways, like praying before a meal, or just the shopkeeper trying to do a good job by his customers, being honest and delivering what he says he's delivering.
Yeah.
That's part of
Oh, absolutely. Even in the littlest moment of, saying something rude to someone or saying something complimentary of someone. The rudeness creates a separation between you and the other, and the compliment creates a union with you and the other. And that brings us back to the idea that every moment has its possibilities. Every moment presents us with the challenge of, are we going to approach this moment as a world conqueror, or are we going to approach this moment as a lover, right? And every moment can invite us to make one or another of those choices.
Thank you, Richard. I think this is a very rich discussion, and you've really thought through, and I can tell, thought through a lot of these things with your students, and kind of thinking through these issues with them, which is itself a loving act, when we think together rather than just thinking apart, but we try to just make sense to you, can you use this thought in your life? And of course, that's what we're about with the Life Wisdom Project. I had a lot of speculative interest as a philosopher, but the bottom line is how does this affect your life and mine? And what wisdom can we draw from that about how to live? And I think you've really contributed to that effort here today, Richard.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about this stuff, Jerry.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.